The rain had not ceased for 3 days. It fell against the windows of Valerius' house in heavy, unrelenting sheets, turning the gravel paths of the garden into shallow streams, and filling the stables with the smell of wet hay and restless horses. Inside the great house, the servants moved quietly, keeping to the edges of rooms, speaking in low voices when they spoke at all. The atmosphere had been strained for weeks, and everyone below stairs knew that something was coming, though no one would say precisely what. Elena Cross was not supposed to be in the library that night. She was not supposed to be anywhere in the house after the candles had been extinguished and the family had retired, but the Duke had asked her to come, and she had never been able to refuse him. She stood near the fire with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her dark woolen dress still damp at the hem from the journey through the servants' passages, and watched Alexander Valerius pace the length of the room with the restless energy of a man who had not slept properly in a month. He was 32 years old, the 9th Duke of Valerius, master of one of the oldest estates in Yorkshire, and he looked at that moment like a soldier who had been fighting a long war and had finally begun to lose. His dark hair was dishevelled, his cravat loosened, and there were shadows beneath his grey eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too many difficult decisions made in solitude. "They are saying you stole the royal seals," he said, stopping near the window and staring out into the darkness where the rain continued to fall. His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the strain beneath it. "Lord Ashworth presented evidence to the council this morning. Letters. A seal press. Documents that could only have come from my study." Elena felt the words like a physical blow, but she did not flinch. She had learned long ago not to show fear in this house, not because she was brave, but because she had discovered that fear only made everything worse. She had been in service at Valerius' house since she was 17 years old, first as a kitchen maid, then as a housemaid, and then, through a series of circumstances that still seemed improbable to her, as the Duke's private secretary and confidant. She was 24 now, and she had spent the last 3 years helping Alexander Valerius manage an estate that had been teetering on the edge of ruin long before he inherited it. "I have never touched the seals," she said quietly. "I have never been in your study without your knowledge. I have never taken anything from this house that did not belong to me." The Duke turned from the window and looked at her, and for a moment the mask of composure that he wore so carefully in public slipped, and she saw the exhaustion and the fear and the desperate hope that lay beneath it. He crossed the room and took her hands in his, and his grip was warm and firm and trembled slightly, as though he were holding on to something that he knew he was about to lose. "I believe you," he said. "Elena, you must know that I believe you, but the council does not. Lord Ashworth has been looking for a way to undermine my position for years, and this is the opportunity he has been waiting for. He has witnesses who claim they saw you entering my study at night. He has a seal press that was found among your belongings. Someone put it there." "Yes, I know, but proving it is another matter entirely." He released her hands and stepped back, and she watched the struggle play out across his face. "The council has demanded that I take action. They want you dismissed. They want you removed from the estate. Some of them are calling for formal charges." Elena stood very still. The fire crackled behind her, and the rain continued to beat against the windows, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the wind moving through the chimneys like a low, mournful voice. She thought about the secret she had been carrying for the past 2 months, the secret she had not yet found the courage to tell him, and she felt something cold settle in her chest. "If I leave," she said, "will it be enough? Will the council be satisfied?" The Duke's jaw tightened. "I do not want you to leave." "That is not what I asked." For a long moment he said nothing. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and accustomed to authority, but she had learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression that others missed, and she could see the weight of his position pressing down on him. He was not merely a man making a decision about a servant. He was a duke, trying to hold together an estate, a title, and a legacy that had been crumbling for a generation, and he was being asked to choose between his heart and his duty, and she already knew which one he would choose. She had always known. "The council meets again in 3 days," he said finally. "If you were gone by then, if there was no sign of you, if it appeared that I had taken decisive action, They might be satisfied. It would give me time to investigate, to find out who really took the seals, to clear your name. And then? He looked at her, and she saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. There would be no "and then." If she left, she would not be coming back. The scandal would follow her, and the Duke could not afford to be associated with a woman accused of stealing royal seals, no matter how much he might wish otherwise. His position was too precarious, his enemies too numerous. She understood this, and part of her even accepted it, but that did not make the pain any less sharp. "I see," she said. "Elena, you do not need to explain. I understand." She straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "I will leave tomorrow morning. Before dawn. No one will see me go." The Duke stepped toward her again, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her, might say something that would change everything, might finally give voice to the feelings that had been growing between them for 3 years. But he stopped short, and his hands remained at his sides, and the moment passed. "I will send money," he said. "Enough to keep you safe, enough to start again somewhere far from here. I will arrange passage on a ship to—" "No." The word came out more sharply than she intended, and she saw the surprise flicker across his face. "If you send money, someone will find out. Someone will trace it, and then they will say that you were complicit, that you helped me escape, that the theft was your doing as well as mine. You cannot be connected to me after I leave. You know this." He knew it. She could see it in the way his shoulders dropped, in the way he did not argue. He had been raised to protect the estate above all else, to preserve the Valerius name and the Valerius legacy, and no matter what he felt for her, that duty would always come first. She had known this from the beginning, and she had allowed herself to hope anyway, and now she was paying the price for that hope. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I do not know yet, but I will find somewhere." She did not tell him about the child. She did not tell him that she was carrying his heir, that the future of the House of Valerius was growing inside her, even as he arranged for her banishment. She told herself that it was because she did not want to burden him, because she did not want to force him into an impossible choice. But the truth was simpler and more painful. She did not tell him because she was afraid that he would choose the estate anyway, and she did not think she could bear to hear him say it. "I will find a way to make this right," he said. "I swear it. When the council's investigation is complete, when Ashworth's lies are exposed, I will find you. I will bring you back." Elena looked at him for a long moment, memorizing the lines of his face, the color of his eyes, the way the firelight caught the silver at his temples. She had loved him for 3 years, quietly and without expectation, and she knew that she would love him long after she left this place. But she also knew that she would never come back. "Goodbye, Your Grace," she said, and she turned and walked out of the library without looking back, and the sound of the rain swallowed the sound of her footsteps, and the Duke stood alone in the firelight and did not follow her. She left before dawn the next morning, just as she had promised. The storm had finally begun to ease, but the roads were still muddy and treacherous, and the cold was the kind that seeped through clothing and settled deep in the bones. She carried a small bundle containing everything she owned: 2 dresses, a woolen shawl, a few coins she had saved over the years, and a silver locket that had belonged to her mother. She did not look back at Valerius' house as she walked down the long drive toward the gate. She did not cry. She simply walked, one foot in front of the other, through the grey morning light and the lingering drizzle, until the house disappeared behind the trees, and she was alone on the road, with nothing but the future stretching out before her. The journey to the coast took 4 days. She walked most of the way, accepting rides from farmers and merchants when they were offered, sleeping in barns and hedgerows when she could find no other shelter. She had never traveled alone before, and the vulnerability of her position was never far from her mind, but she was too exhausted and too heartsick to be properly afraid. She simply kept moving, driven by the knowledge that she could not stop, that she could not go back, that the only direction available to her was forward. When she finally reached the port town of Whitby, she had exactly 11 shillings left, a pair of shoes that were nearly worn through, and a growing certainty that the child she carried was the only thing that mattered now. She found lodgings in a cramped room above a tavern near the harbour, paid for a week in advance, and began looking for work. The first month was the hardest. The money ran out faster than she had anticipated, and the work she could find, washing clothes, mending nets, cleaning fish, paid barely enough to keep her fed. She was sick often, weakened by the pregnancy and the poor food and the constant cold, and there were days when she thought she might simply lie down in her narrow bed and not get up again. But she did get up, every morning, because she had no other choice. There was a life growing inside her, a life that depended entirely on her survival, and she refused to let it down. It was in the second month that her circumstances began to change. The tavern where she was staying was owned by a man named Silas Brewer, a weathered old merchant who had spent 40 years sailing between Whitby and the trading ports of the Baltic. He had retired from the sea a decade earlier, and now ran the tavern as a kind of hobby, though his true passion remained the shipping business that his son now managed. He noticed Elena one evening, when she was helping the tavern keeper organize the accounts, and he watched her work in silence for nearly an hour before speaking. "You can read," he said. It was not a question. Elena looked up from the ledger, startled. "Yes, I can read, and write, and do sums. And you understand numbers? I was educated by the parish school until I was 14. After that, I taught myself." She did not mention the 3 years she had spent helping to manage the Valerius estate, the ledgers she had balanced, the contracts she had reviewed, the shipping schedules she had organized. She had learned that it was safer not to mention the Valerius name at all. Silas Brewer studied her for a long moment, his sharp blue eyes taking in her worn dress, her calloused hands, the determined set of her jaw. He was a shrewd man, and he had spent his life learning to read people as carefully as he read shipping manifests. "My son needs a clerk," he said. "Someone who can manage the paperwork, track the shipments, write the correspondence. He cannot find anyone competent who will work for what he can afford to pay. The wage is not generous, but it is steady, and it comes with a small room above the counting house. Would you be interested?" Elena felt something shift inside her, a small flicker of hope that she had not felt in weeks. She did not allow herself to show it. She simply nodded and said, "Yes, I would be interested." She started work the following Monday. The counting house was a cramped, drafty building near the harbor, filled with stacks of papers and the constant smell of salt and ink. Thomas Brewer, Silas's son, was a harried young man in his late 20s, who seemed perpetually on the verge of collapse. He had inherited his father's shipping business, but none of his father's organizational skills, and the office was in chaos. Elena spent her first week simply sorting through the accumulated paperwork. She organized the manifests, reconciled the accounts, and created a system for tracking incoming and outgoing shipments. By the end of the second week, Thomas Brewer was looking at her with something approaching awe. "My father said you were clever," he said, "but I did not expect this. You have saved me months of work." "It is what I was trained to do," Elena said, and then she stopped, because she had not meant to say that. Thomas did not press her. He was not a curious man by nature, and he was too relieved to have someone competent handling the paperwork to question where she had acquired her skills. He simply paid her the agreed wage and left her to her work, and Elena settled into a routine that was exhausting but manageable. She rose early, worked until the light faded, and fell into bed too tired to think about the life she had left behind. The months passed, her pregnancy progressed, and she continued working until the very day the labor began. The birth was difficult. There was no money for a proper physician, only a midwife from the harbor who had delivered hundreds of babies and was not easily alarmed. But Elena survived it, and so did the child, a daughter, small but healthy, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that, even in the first hours, seemed to hold a startling intelligence. She named her Clara, after her own mother, and she held the baby against her chest in the narrow room above the counting house, and wept for the first time since leaving Valerius' house. She wept for the life she had lost, and for the man she had loved, and for the daughter, who would never know her father. And then she dried her eyes, and she fed her child, and she went back to work the following morning, because there was no one else to do it. The years that followed were not easy, but they were transformative. Elena discovered that she had a gift for trade. It was not merely that she could manage accounts and organize shipments. She had an instinct for it, a sense of when to buy and when to sell, when to take risks and when to be cautious. She began by helping Thomas Brewer expand his father's modest shipping operation, identifying new routes and new markets that the Brewers had never considered. When Thomas died unexpectedly of a fever 3 years after her arrival, it was Elena who kept the business running, negotiating with creditors and reassuring anxious clients, while the grieving Silas Brewer struggled to cope with the loss of his son. By then, Silas had come to trust her completely. He had watched her work for 3 years, had seen her intelligence, and her determination, and her unshakable integrity, and he had come to regard her almost as a daughter. When his health began to fail, he made a decision that shocked the entire port. "I am leaving the business to you," he told her one evening, sitting in his chair by the fire with a blanket across his knees. "Thomas is gone. I have no other children. The business will die if I leave it to anyone else, and I will not see my life's work destroyed. You understand it better than anyone. You care about it. It should be yours." Elena stared at him. "I cannot accept that. It is too much." "It is not enough," Silas said. "You have done more for this family than anyone, and I have never properly thanked you. This is the only way I know to do it." He died 6 months later, and Elena inherited the Brewer shipping business, a small fleet of 3 vessels, and a modest amount of capital. She was 28 years old, the mother of a 4-year-old daughter, and the owner of a trading company that most people in Whitby expected to fail within a year. It did not fail. Within 2 years, she had doubled the fleet. Within 4, she had expanded the business to include trading posts in 3 ports along the Baltic and a growing presence in the Mediterranean. She negotiated contracts with merchants in Hamburg and Copenhagen, established relationships with textile producers in Leeds and Manchester, and built a reputation for fairness and reliability that drew clients from across the north of England. By the time Clara was 7 years old, Elena Cross was one of the wealthiest merchants in Yorkshire, and the name Brewer Trading Company was known in every major port from London to St. Petersburg. She had not forgotten Alexander Valerius. She had tried, in the early years, to put him out of her mind, to focus entirely on the life she was building and the daughter she was raising. But the memories persisted, surfacing at unexpected moments, in the sound of rain against a window, in the scent of leather and old books, in the grey of a winter sky. She did not hate him. She understood, perhaps too well, the impossible position he had been in, but she did not forgive him either, and she had no intention of ever seeing him again. The past, she told herself, was the past. She had built a new life from nothing, and she had done it alone, and she owed nothing to anyone. That conviction lasted until the autumn of Clara's 7th year, when a letter arrived that changed everything. It came on a grey afternoon in late September, delivered by a messenger who had ridden hard from the south, and it bore the seal of the house of Valerius. Elena stared at it for a long time, before breaking the wax, and when she finally read the words inside, she felt the past rush back with the force of a winter storm. "My dear Elena, I do not know if this letter will reach you. I have spent 7 years searching for you, and every trail has gone cold. But I have recently received information that suggests you may be in Whitby, and if there is any chance that this letter finds you, I must take it. I know that I have no right to ask anything of you. I know that what I did was unforgivable, but I am begging you to hear me. The estate is failing. Lord Ashworth's schemes have come to light. He admitted on his deathbed that he fabricated the evidence against you, but the damage was done long ago. Without your guidance, I have made poor decisions. The debts have mounted. The lands are no longer productive. The house itself may be lost before the year is out. I am not asking for your help because I deserve it. I am asking because there are people on this estate who will suffer if it collapses. Tenants, servants, families who have lived on Valerius land for generations. I cannot save them alone. If there is any part of you that remembers what we once were to each other, I am begging you to come. Yours in desperation, Alexander Valerius. Elena read the letter 3 times, her expression unreadable. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer of her desk, and did not look at it again for 3 days. On the 4th day, she called for her carriage. The journey from Whitby to the Valerius estate took 2 days. Elena travelled with her daughter and a small retinue of servants, though she had told Clara only that they were visiting an old acquaintance of her mother's. Clara, who was a bright and curious child with her father's grey eyes and her mother's determined chin, had accepted this explanation without question and spent most of the journey looking out the window and asking questions about the countryside. "Is this where you grew up, Mama?" she asked as they passed through a village of grey stone cottages. "Not far from here," Elena said. "I lived here for a time, many years ago." "Before I was born?" "Yes, before you were born." Clara considered this. Was it a happy time? Elena was silent for a moment. The landscape was familiar now, the rolling hills and stone walls and ancient oaks, and every mile brought her closer to the life she had left behind. She thought about the question and realized that she did not know how to answer it. "It was complicated," she said finally. "Some parts were happy, others were not." Clara nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to looking out the window. Elena watched her daughter for a moment, studying the familiar curve of her cheek, and the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, and felt the familiar ache of love and protectiveness that had been with her since the day Clara was born. She had not told her daughter about her father, had not told anyone, and she did not know if she was making the right decision by bringing her here. But something in the Duke's letter had moved her, and she could not ignore it. They arrived at Valerius' house in the late afternoon. The carriage rolled up the long drive between the ancient oaks, and Elena looked out at the estate she had once known so well, and felt her heart sink. The signs of decline were everywhere. The gravel drive was rutted and overgrown. The gardens that had once been meticulously maintained were now tangled and wild. The house itself was still standing, but the stone was darkened with years of accumulated grime, and several of the windows were shuttered. The servants who met them at the door were few and aging, and their faces showed the strain of years of neglect. Elena recognized some of them: old Mrs. Hartley, who had been the housekeeper when Elena was in service, and Thomas the footman, now grey-haired and stooped, and she saw the shock in their eyes when they recognized her in return. "Miss Cross," Mrs. Hartley breathed. "Is it really you?" "It is," Elena said. "I am here to see the Duke." She was shown into the same library where she had last stood 7 years earlier. The room had changed. The fire was burning low, and the curtains were faded, and there was a layer of dust on the bookshelves that spoke of long neglect. And standing by the window, his back to the door, was Alexander Valerius. He turned when he heard her enter, and she saw that the years had not been kind to him. He was still a handsome man, but his face was deeply lined, and his hair was now more grey than dark, and there was a weariness in his bearing that had not been there before. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the recognition dawn slowly in his eyes, followed by something that might have been hope. "Elena," he said, "you came." "I received your letter." She remained near the door, keeping her distance. "You said the estate was failing." "It is. I told you the truth." He took a step toward her, then stopped, as though uncertain of his welcome. "I did not know if you would come. I was not sure you would even receive the letter. I almost did not come." She studied him for a moment, taking in the worn cuffs of his coat, the exhausted lines around his eyes. "What happened, Alexander? When I left, the estate was stable. The debts were manageable. I left you a plan. I could not follow it without you. The admission seemed to cost him something. I tried. I hired other secretaries, other advisors. None of them understood the estate the way you did. And I was not myself, after you left. I made mistakes, bad investments, poor decisions. Ashworth's schemes continued for years before they were finally exposed, and by then the damage was done. You said in your letter that he confessed. On his deathbed, yes. He admitted that he had arranged the theft of the seals, that he had planted the evidence against you, that he had done it to weaken my position. He had been working with several other lords who wanted to see the Valerius estate broken up and sold. They nearly succeeded. Elena absorbed this information in silence. She had known, even at the time, that she was being framed. She had suspected Ashworth. But hearing it confirmed brought a complicated mixture of emotions that she did not have time to examine. "I am sorry," the Duke said. "I know that means nothing after all this time. But I am sorry. I should have defended you. I should have refused to let you go. Yes, Elena said. You should have. She walked past him to the window and looked out at the overgrown gardens. What do you want from me, Alexander? Why did you ask me to come? I need your help. The estate is on the verge of collapse. The creditors are demanding payment. If I cannot find a way to pay the debts, everything will be lost. The house, the lands, the tenants' farms. I have tried everything I can think of, and nothing has worked. I hoped, that you might have ideas. You always understood these things better than anyone. Elena turned to face him. You want me to help you save the estate? Yes. The estate that you chose over me 7 years ago. The Duke flinched, but he did not look away. Yes. The estate that would have let me freeze to death in a storm, rather than risk its reputation. Elena. I am not finished. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. I came here because your letter moved me, and because I remember the people who live on this land, and because they do not deserve to suffer for your mistakes. But I did not come here to forgive you. I did not come here to help you. I came here to tell you that I already know about the debts. The Duke stared at her. What do you mean? I mean that I have spent the last 7 years building a trading company that now operates in a dozen ports across Europe. I have ships and warehouses and contracts and capital, and over the past year, I have been quietly purchasing your debts. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a sheaf of papers, which she placed on the desk between them. The mortgage on the North Fields, the loan from the London bank, the promissory notes you signed with the merchants in Leeds. I hold all of them now. The color drained from the Duke's face. He picked up the papers with trembling hands and read through them, and she watched the realization dawn in his eyes. You own me, he said. I own your debts, Elena corrected. What that means is up to you. I could call them in tomorrow and take everything. I could force the sale of the estate, the dispersal of the lands, the end of the house of Valerius, or I could help you. I could restructure the debts, provide new capital, bring in the people and resources necessary to restore the estate to what it once was. The choice is mine. The Duke set the papers down slowly. Why would you help me, after everything that happened? I have not decided that I will. Elena met his gaze steadily. But I have not decided that I will not, either. There is something you need to know, before I make my decision. Something I should have told you 7 years ago. She walked to the door and opened it. Clara, she called. Come here, please. The Duke looked confused, but he said nothing. A moment later, a small figure appeared in the doorway. A dark-haired girl in a blue traveling dress. Her grey eyes curious and intelligent as she looked around the room. Clara, Elena said, I would like you to meet someone. This is the Duke of Valerius. Clara curtsied, perfectly composed. How do you do, Your Grace? The Duke stared at the child. His face had gone very still. Elena, he said slowly. Who is this? This is my daughter, Elena said. Her name is Clara. She was born 7 years ago, 7 months after I left this house. She paused, letting the words settle. She is your daughter, Alexander. She is your heir. The silence that followed was absolute. The Duke looked from Elena to Clara and back again, and she saw the understanding break over him like a wave. His hand went to the back of a chair, gripping it for support. I have a daughter, he said. It was not a question. You have a daughter. You have had a daughter for 7 years, and if I decide to help you save this estate, it will be for her sake, not for yours. The Duke sank into the chair, his legs apparently unable to support him any longer. He looked at Clara, who was watching him with polite curiosity, and Elena saw tears begin to form in his eyes. She has my eyes, he said. Yes, she does. And she does not know me. No, she does not. The Duke pressed a hand over his eyes, and was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. You raised her alone. You built a business. You became wealthy. You did all of it without me. Yes. And you came here today not because you needed my help, but because I needed yours. Yes. He lowered his hand and looked at her, and she saw something in his expression that she had never seen before. It was not merely regret or shame or gratitude. It was something closer to awe. Tell me what you want me to do, he said. I will do anything." Elena looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at her daughter, who was still standing in the doorway, still watching, still waiting, and she made a decision. "You will do nothing," she said, "until Clara has made her own judgment. She is the one who will inherit this estate someday, if it survives. She is the one who will carry the Valerius name, if she chooses to. She deserves to know who you are, and to decide for herself whether you are worthy of a second chance." The Duke looked at Clara, and Clara looked at the Duke, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Clara stepped forward, her small face serious, and asked the question that would determine everything. "Are you the man who made my mother sad?" The Duke's composure shattered. He knelt down so that he was at her eye level, and the tears that had been threatening finally spilled over. "Yes," he said, "I am. I made her very sad, and I have been sorry every day since then. I did not know about you. If I had known, I would have done everything differently. I would have come for her. I would have come for both of you." Clara considered this for a moment. "Mama says that saying sorry is not enough. You have to show that you mean it." "Your mother is right. What can I do to show you that I mean it?" Clara looked at her mother, who nodded slightly. Then she looked back at the Duke. "You can try," she said, "and we will see." It was not forgiveness. It was not even a promise. But it was a beginning, and as Elena watched her daughter extend her small hand to the man who had once been the love of her life, she felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it, distant but real, like the first light of dawn after a long and bitter night. Outside the window, the rain had finally stopped, and the clouds were beginning to break. A shaft of pale autumn sunlight fell across the library floor, illuminating the dust and the faded curtains, and the three figures standing together in the center of the room. The Duke took Clara's hand, and he looked at Elena, and he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. He had spent 7 years searching for the woman he had wronged, and he had found her, and she was not the girl he remembered. She was something else entirely. She was the kingdom's wealthiest merchant, the mother of his child, the holder of his debts, and the keeper of his fate. And whether he deserved it or not, she had given him a chance to prove himself. He intended to spend the rest of his life taking it. The weeks that followed Elena's arrival at Valerius' house were unlike anything the estate had seen in a generation. The Duke had expected her to remain for a few days, perhaps to offer advice, certainly to demand some form of repayment for the debts she now held. He had not expected her to take up residence in the East Wing with her daughter and her servants, to commandeer the dusty study that had once been his father's, and to begin systematically dismantling and rebuilding the entire financial structure of the Valerius estate, as though it were a broken clock that simply needed the right hands to set it running again. But that was exactly what she did. Within 3 days of her arrival, Elena had reviewed every ledger, every account book, every outstanding debt and uncollected rent, and neglected investment. She worked from early morning until late at night, pausing only to take meals with Clara and to meet with the Duke, who found himself increasingly relegated to the role of observer in his own house. He did not resent this. In fact, he found it oddly comforting. For the first time in 7 years, someone competent was in control, and the relief he felt was so profound that it sometimes kept him awake at night, wondering how he had ever managed to function without her. "The situation is worse than I expected," Elena told him on the 4th morning, spreading a dozen papers across the desk in the study. "The debts are larger than your letter suggested. The income from the tenant farms has fallen by nearly half since I left. Several of your investments have failed entirely. The London Bank is threatening legal action." The Duke, who had been standing by the window, turned to face her. "I know. I have been trying to hold them off, but they are losing patience. They are losing patience because they believe you cannot pay. They are correct, as things stand." Elena picked up one of the papers and studied it. "But things are about to change. I have arranged for a line of credit through my own company to cover the most urgent debts. The London Bank will be paid within the week. The Leeds merchants will receive their money by the end of the month. And the rest? The rest will take longer. The estate needs significant investment if it is to become profitable again. The drainage systems in the lower fields need to be rebuilt. The tenants need better equipment and seed. The house itself requires repairs that cannot be delayed much longer. I estimate that it will take at least 2 years to restore the estate to stability, and perhaps 5 before it begins to generate significant income. The Duke absorbed this. 2 years. That is less time than I feared. It is also more time than you have, unless you accept my terms. What terms? Elena set the paper down and looked at him directly. I will provide the capital necessary to save the estate. I will manage the investments and oversee the improvements. I will negotiate with the creditors and restructure the debts. In return, I want a formal partnership. Half of all future profits from the estate will go to me, to be held in trust for Clara until she comes of age. I also want legal recognition of Clara's status as your legitimate heir. The Duke was silent for a long moment. The request was unprecedented. A former servant demanding a partnership in a ducal estate, demanding legitimacy for a child born out of wedlock. It was the kind of arrangement that would have scandalized society if it became widely known. But he had spent 7 years learning the price of pride, and he was not going to make the same mistake again. Agreed, he said. I will have the papers drawn up immediately. Good. Elena gathered the papers into a neat stack. There is one more thing. Clara will need to be introduced to the household gradually. She does not know you, and she does not trust easily. You will need to earn her affection, not demand it. I understand. I hope you do, because if you hurt her, Alexander, I will not simply call in your debts. I will destroy you. She said it calmly, without menace, but the Duke did not doubt for a moment that she meant every word. He nodded, and she returned to her work, and the conversation was over. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of business and personal negotiation. Elena threw herself into the work of saving the estate with the same fierce determination that had built her trading empire, and the Duke watched her transformation with a mixture of admiration and regret. She was not the quiet, deferential young woman he remembered. She was a force of nature, confident and decisive, accustomed to command. She gave orders to servants and merchants alike, and they obeyed her without question, recognizing the authority in her voice, even if they did not understand where it came from. The household staff, many of whom remembered Elena from her years in service, were initially uncertain how to treat her. She was no longer a maid, but she was not quite a lady either, and her position in the house was difficult to define. Mrs. Hartley, the aging housekeeper, solved the problem by simply treating Elena as though she had always been the mistress of the house, and the other servants followed her lead. Within a fortnight, it felt almost natural to see Elena Cross sitting at the head of the dinner table, discussing crop rotations and shipping schedules with the Duke, as though they were equals. Clara, meanwhile, was slowly becoming accustomed to her new surroundings. She was a quiet, observant child, and she spent her first days at Valerius' house, exploring the gardens and the corridors and the empty rooms, with the curiosity of a natural scholar. She asked endless questions of the servants, who found her both charming and slightly unnerving. There was something about the child's grey eyes, so like the Duke's, that made them feel as though they were being examined by someone far older and wiser than her 7 years. The Duke tried, in his own awkward way, to build a relationship with his daughter. He did not know how to talk to children. He had never spent time with them, had never imagined himself as a father, and his early attempts were stilted and uncertain. He asked Clara about her lessons, her interests, her favorite foods. She answered politely but without warmth, and he sensed that she was watching him, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. On a grey afternoon in late October, the Duke was in the library, reviewing the plans for the drainage improvements that Elena had commissioned, when Clara appeared in the doorway. She was carrying a book, an old volume of natural history that she had found in one of the unused rooms, and she looked at him with an expression that was part curiosity, part challenge. "Mama says you know about the stars," she said. The Duke looked up, surprised. "I know a little. I used to study astronomy when I was younger. Could you teach me?" It was the first time she had asked him for anything. The Duke closed the ledger he had been reading and gestured for her to come in. "Of course. What would you like to know?" Clara crossed the room and climbed onto the chair opposite his desk, settling the heavy book in her lap. "I want to know why the stars move." Mama says they stay in the same place, but I have watched them, and they move across the sky every night. The Duke smiled for the first time in what felt like years. That is an excellent question. The stars do appear to move, but it is actually the Earth that is moving, not the stars. The Earth spins like a top, and that makes the stars seem to travel across the sky. Clara considered this. How fast does it spin? Faster than you might think. But we do not feel it, because we are moving with it. Like being in a carriage. Yes, exactly like being in a carriage. When you are inside a carriage, you do not feel the movement in the same way, but if you look out the window, you can see the landscape passing by. Clara nodded, apparently satisfied, and the conversation continued for nearly an hour. The Duke found himself explaining the constellations, the planets, the phases of the moon, and with each question Clara asked, he felt something opening between them, a connection that was tentative and fragile, but undeniably real. She was not just intelligent, she was hungry for knowledge, eager to understand the world around her, and he recognized in her the same curiosity that had driven him as a boy, before the weight of the duchy had crushed it out of him. When Elena came to find Clara for supper, she paused in the doorway and watched them for a moment without speaking. The Duke was pointing to a diagram in the book, and Clara was leaning forward, her small face intent, and neither of them noticed her standing there. The North Star is the one that sailors use to navigate, the Duke was saying. It stays almost perfectly still while the other stars rotate around it. If you can find the North Star, you can always tell which direction you are traveling. Even in a storm? Clara asked. Even in a storm, if the clouds part long enough to see it, the North Star is constant, it does not change. Elena stepped into the room, and both of them looked up. Clara's face was more animated than Elena had seen it in weeks, and the Duke's expression was softer, less guarded. Supper is ready, Elena said. Clara, go and wash your hands. Clara slid off the chair and hurried out of the room, still carrying the book. The Duke watched her go, and when he turned back to Elena, there was something in his eyes that she had not seen before. She is remarkable, he said. Yes, she is. You have raised her well. I do not deserve to know her. Elena did not contradict him. She simply said, what you deserve is not the question. What matters is what you do now. I want to do better, he said. I want to be worthy of her, of both of you. Then keep trying, Elena said. That is all any of us can do. The months that followed were not without their difficulties. The work of restoring the estate was grueling, and there were setbacks and frustrations and moments when it seemed as though nothing would ever be enough. The drainage improvements were delayed by early winter storms. A shipment of seed was lost at sea. One of the tenant farmers, suspicious of the changes being made, refused to cooperate with the new arrangements and had to be persuaded through long and patient negotiation. But slowly, incrementally, things began to improve. The debts were paid. The creditors were satisfied. The fields were prepared for spring planting. And inside Valerius' house, something else was changing. Something that had nothing to do with ledgers and contracts and agricultural improvements. The Duke and his daughter were learning to know each other. It was not a swift or easy process. There were days when Clara was distant, when she retreated into her books and her lessons and seemed to forget that he existed. There were moments when the Duke said the wrong thing, revealed his ignorance of children and their needs, and had to apologize and try again. But there were also evenings by the fire when Clara would ask him about the stars, and mornings when she would accompany him on walks through the estate, and afternoons when she would sit in the library and draw pictures while he worked at his desk, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the distance between them began to close. Elena watched this transformation with complicated emotions. She had not come to Valerius' house expecting to forgive Alexander. She had not even come expecting to help him, not really. She had come because his letter had reminded her of the people who depended on the estate, the tenants and servants and families who had done nothing to deserve the ruin that was coming for them. She had come because Clara deserved to know her heritage, whatever she chose to do with it. She had come because, despite everything, some small part of her had never stopped caring about the man she had once loved. But she had not expected to see him change. She had not expected to watch him struggle and fail and try again, to see him humbled by his own mistakes, to witness the slow, painful process of a proud man learning to be something other than what he had always been. She had not expected to feel the first stirrings of something that might, in time, become forgiveness. The winter passed, and spring came to the Valerius estate. The fields that had been drained and prepared began to show the first green shoots of new growth. The tenant farmers, cautiously optimistic, planted their crops and repaired their fences, and began to believe, for the first time in years, that the future might be better than the past. And in the great house, behind the ancient stone walls that had witnessed so much sorrow and so many secrets, a family was slowly, tentatively, beginning to form. It was on an evening in late April that everything changed. Elena was in the study, reviewing the quarterly accounts, when the Duke appeared in the doorway. He was dressed more formally than usual, and there was a tension in his bearing that made her set down her pen and give him her full attention. "What is it?" she asked. "I need to speak with you. About Clara. About the future." Elena gestured for him to sit. He did not sit. Instead, he walked to the window and stood looking out at the garden, where the first spring flowers were beginning to bloom. "I have been thinking about what you said when you first arrived," he said. "About Clara needing to make her own judgment, about whether I am worthy of a second chance. And I have been thinking about the past, about everything I did wrong, about everything I should have done differently. Alexander, please, let me finish." He turned to face her. "I have spent 7 years regretting the choices I made. I have spent 7 years wondering what became of you, hoping you were safe, praying that somehow, against all odds, I might have the chance to make things right. And then you appeared, and you were not the woman I remembered. You were someone stronger, someone I admired even more than I had before. And you brought me a daughter I did not know I had, and you gave me a chance I did not deserve, and I have spent every day since then trying to prove that I am not the man who let you walk into that storm." He paused, and Elena saw that his hands were trembling slightly. "I know I cannot undo the past. I know I cannot give you back the years you lost, or the suffering you endured, or the life you built without me, but I am asking you, I am begging you, to let me try to give you something else. A future, a partnership, not just in business, but in everything. I am asking you to marry me." The words hung in the air between them. Elena stared at him, and for a long moment she could not speak. The proposal was so unexpected, so utterly improbable, that she did not know how to process it. "You want to marry me," she said finally. "Yes. The woman who owns your debts, the former maid, the mother of your illegitimate child. Yes. Do you have any idea what society will say?" "I do not care what society will say." The Duke crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "I care what you will say. I care what Clara will say. Nothing else matters." Elena looked down at their joined hands, at the fine bones of his fingers, and the calluses on her own palms, and she thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The betrayal, the banishment, the years of struggle and solitude and slow, painstaking triumph, the letter that had summoned her back, the weeks of working side by side, rebuilding not just an estate but something deeper, something neither of them had been willing to name. "I do not know if I can forgive you," she said quietly. "Not completely, not yet. I know. And I will not marry you simply to save the estate, or to give Clara a legitimate name, or because it is the practical thing to do. I did not build my life from nothing only to become a convenience. I am not asking you to be a convenience. I am asking you to be my wife." Elena was silent for a long moment. She thought about Clara, who had slowly begun to look forward to her evenings with the Duke, who had started to ask questions about him that were no longer merely polite. She thought about the estate, which was finally beginning to show signs of recovery. She thought about herself, about the dreams she had once harbored as a young woman in service, about the love she had felt for this man, and the pain she had endured when he let her go. And she thought about the man kneeling before her now, who was not the same man she had left 7 years ago. He was older, wearier, humbler. He had made terrible mistakes, and he had paid for them, and he was still trying, every day, to be better. "I will consider it," she said, "but I will not give you an answer tonight." The Duke nodded. "That is more than I deserve." "Yes," Elena said, It is. She did not give him an answer for 3 weeks. During that time, she watched him closely, watched how he interacted with Clara, with the servants, with the tenants. She watched how he handled the daily frustrations of managing the estate, how he responded to setbacks and disappointments, how he treated people who could do nothing for him. She was looking for signs that his transformation was genuine, that the man he appeared to be now was the man he would remain. And slowly, gradually, she began to believe that it was. The answer came on a warm evening in May, when the three of them were walking together in the garden. Clara had run ahead to examine a patch of wildflowers, and Elena and the Duke were following at a slower pace, and the setting sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. "I have made my decision," Elena said. The Duke stopped walking. "And?" "I will marry you, on 3 conditions." "Name them." "First, Clara will be formally recognized as your legitimate heir immediately. I will not wait until the wedding for her to have the security she deserves." "Agreed." "Second, I will retain control of my own business and my own finances. I did not spend 7 years building an empire only to hand it over to a husband. The partnership between the estate and my trading company will continue as we have arranged it." "Agreed." "And third, if you ever betray me again, if you ever choose your pride or your reputation over your family, I will leave, and I will take Clara with me, and I will not come back, and this time, I will make certain that you never find us." The Duke met her eyes steadily. "I understand, and I accept." "Then yes," Elena said, "I will marry you." The Duke did not speak. He simply reached for her hand and held it, and they stood together in the fading light, watching their daughter run through the garden, and the future stretched out before them like a road they had not yet traveled. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, in the small stone church that had served the Valerius estate for 3 centuries. It was a quiet ceremony, attended only by the household staff, a few close friends, and the tenants who had known Elena when she was a maid, and who now watched with wonder as she became a duchess. Clara stood beside her mother as a witness, her grey eyes solemn and proud, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, she was the first to applaud. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. The estate recovered its prosperity, and then exceeded it. Clara grew into a young woman of remarkable intelligence and grace, and when she eventually inherited the duchy, she was more than prepared for the responsibility. And Elena and Alexander, who had begun their journey in betrayal and separation, ended it in partnership and devotion, proving that some wounds can heal, some mistakes can be redeemed, and some loves are strong enough to survive even the longest and darkest of winters. The Duke had thought he was throwing away a common maid to save his family's pride. He had been wrong. He had been throwing away the only woman who could save him, the heir the house of Valerius had nearly lost forever, and the only love that would last him a lifetime. But he had found her again, and this time, he was wise enough to hold on. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell me, do you believe Alexander truly earned his second chance? Or was Elena too forgiving? I read every comment, and I would love to know what you think. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.